Hello, this is David from DN Cognitive Counseling. Tonight we're going to be taking a look at the third chapter of the book White Fragility. As you can tell, I'm absolutely thrilled. She starts off with a couple of quotes from the third chapter, which is titled Racism After the Civil Rights Movement. Children today are so opened. When the old folks die off, we will finally be free of racism. I grew up in a small rural community, so I was very sheltered. I didn't learn anything about racism. I judge people by what they do, not who they are. I don't see color, I see people. We are all red under the skin. I marched in the 60s. Now obviously all these quotes she's giving are negatives that she sees, as she believes that if you're colorblind or that you try to see people as opposed to them being racial, then you are somehow falling into the stereotype of being a racist. Even though identifying people solely by their race is what racism is. Irony. New racism is a term coined by film professor Martin Barker to capture the ways in which racism has adopted over time so that modern norms, policies, and practices result in similar racial outcomes as to those in the past while not appearing to be explicitly racist. Sociologist Eduardo Bonilla-Silver captures this dynamic in the title of his book Racism Without Racists: Colorblind Racism and the Persistence of Racial Inequality in America. He says that through virtually no one claims to be racist anymore, racism still exists. How is that possible? Racism can still exist because it's highly adaptive. Because of this adaptability, we must be able to identify its changes over time. Now, I'd like to understand the mechanisms of its adaptability. I'd like to understand how it changes over time. I'd like to understand the mechanism by which it happens, because just asserting something doesn't make it so. For example, after a white nationalist march and the murder of a counter-protester, the President of the United States said there are very fine people on both sides. Now again, after a white nationalist march and the murder of a counter-protester, the President said there's very fine people on both sides, which of course states that the person that she's saying a white nationalist march is that the President is saying there are fine people on the white nationalist side. The comment would have been unthinkable from high-ranking public officials just a few years ago. Yes, because Barack Obama never said anything that would make you question anything about race, because he never put his foot in it. Not once. Yet if we asked the President if he was a racist, I'm confident that he would reply with a resounding no. In fact, he recently stated that he was the least racist person one could ever meet. And of course with Trump, everything he is the most or least in everything. In this chapter, I review the various ways that racism has adapted over time to continue to produce racial disparity, while it exempts virtually all white people from any involvement in it or benefit from racism. Now before we get to that, she's made a claim that the President of the United States made a statement about something, which is pretty sad because this is actually on video. And the nature of actually being able to hear what somebody says as opposed to putting your narrative on it, and why you want to deal with objectivity as opposed to subjectivity, I felt the President said that. So therefore, I feel that way. That does not make it so. Let's listen to the actual words.
On both sides, sir. You said there was hatred, there was violence on both sides.
Well, I do think there's blame. Yes, I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either. And
the blame he's talking about here is the violence that took place in Charlottesville.
And if you reported it accurately, you would say.
Kill the person. Heather Heyer
Charlottesville. They showed up in Charlottesville to protest.
Excuse me. They didn't know themselves down as you, and you had some very bad people in that group. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group. Excuse me. I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue, and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name.
Just to, again, what he's saying there, and he's delineating between the neo-Nazis and these other people. Now, I wasn't there. I didn't see the pictures. I don't know if there are these other people that were there. But this is his claim, that there were other people besides the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists that were there. He's actually going to make that point a little later.
George Washington was a slave owner. Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, are we going to take down statues to George Washington? How about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson?
What's ironic about this, and this is one of the few times that Trump is dead on right, that the nature of what this was at Charlottesville and the nature of what they wanted to tear down, the logic then goes to the next part, which is actually to this logic, that every white person is part of this systemic aspect of racism and therefore then should also be torn down, which is what exactly this book wants to do in its end.
You like him? Okay, good. Are we going to take down the statue? Because he was a major slave owner. Now we're going to take down his statue. So you know what? It's fine. You're changing history, you're changing culture, and you had people, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally.
Again, clearly stated, I am not talking about the neo-Nazis or the white nationalists. See, this is when you quote something and you make a narrative that is factually incorrect. I am not talking, specifically said, I am not talking about the neo-Nazis or the white nationalists.
But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists, okay? And the press has treated them absolutely unfairly. Now, in the other group also, you had some fine people, but you also had troublemakers, and you see them come with the black outfits and with the helmets and with the baseball bats. You had a lot of bad people in the other group too.
Unfairly, sir, I'm sorry. I just didn't understand what you were saying. You were saying the press has treated white nationalists unfairly.
No,
I just didn't understand what you were saying.
No,
I love how the person in the press asked the question. He just said, I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and I'm not talking about the white nationalists. So the next question is, so you're talking about the white nationalists? Right? So, no. He
there
says
were
again.
people in that rally, and I looked the night before. If you look, there were people protesting very quietly the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. I'm sure in that group there were some bad ones. The following day it looked like they had some rough, bad people, neo-Nazis, white nationalists, whatever you want to call them. But you had a lot of people in that group that were there to innocently protest, and very legally protest, because, you know, I don't know if you know, they had a permit. The other group didn't have a permit. So I only tell you this, there are two sides to a story. I thought what took place was a horrible moment for our country.
Now, what I love about this is that whether you like Trump, hate Trump, whether you think he's the worst thing that ever happened to the country, or you think that he's the best thing since sliced bread, is not irrelevant. What is relevant is there's a narrative here that directly contradicts reality. But who cares? Because why should we ever let reality get involved in the story? And as she talks more and more about narratives and why it's so important, this is somebody who's just rewriting history in order to serve their narrative without any facts. All systems of oppression are adaptive. They can withstand and adjust to challenges and still maintain inequality. Take, for instance, the federal recognition of same-sex marriage and the accommodations for people with disabilities. While the overall system of heterosexism and ableism are still with us, they have adapted in limited ways. These adaptations are held up as reassurances to those who fought long and hard for a particular change that equality has now been achieved. These milestones, such as the recognition of same-sex marriage, the passage of the Americans with Disability Act, Title IX, the elections of Barack Obama, are of course significant and worthy celebration. But systems of oppression are deeply rooted and not overcome with simple passage of legislation. Advances are also tenuous and can see in recent challenges to the rights of the LGBTQI people. Systems of oppression are not completely inflexible, but they are far less flexible than popular ideology, which acknowledges and the collective impact of the inequitable distribution of resources continues across history. So again, she's saying just legislation has changed. Nothing else has changed. We have no systematic aspects of change because only the nature of the laws have changed. This came from the Pew Research Center. Key facts about race and marriage, 50 years. In 1967, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the Loving, Virginia case that marriage across racial lines was legal, and that intermarriage has increased steadily. Since then, 1 in 6 newlyweds, 17% were married to a person of a different race. Now, I'm not going to go through the rest of the pews because they're irrelevant to this chapter and what we're trying to do. We've gone from a position where nobody intermarried to 17% of our population intermarrying. But no, that's not because they're any less racist. That's only because we made laws. Again, I know reality is something that they don't want to deal with. They don't want to actually look at what's real. They want to call everybody something and put them in a box so they don't have to deal with them. And I love how she keeps spending the entire time saying the same thing over and over. Racism is blind. Racism is in the country. You can't get rid of it. Over and over. Colorblind racism. What is termed colorblind racism is an example of racism's ability to adapt to cultural changes. According to this ideology, if we pretend not to notice race, then there can be no racism. Well, actually, factually, that would be true. If you had the ability to make everybody literally blind and nobody could tell anybody's race, yes, you'd basically be getting rid of racism. The idea is based on the line from the famous "I Have a Dream" speech given by Dr. Martin Luther King in 1963 by the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Now, obviously, you can't make everybody blind, and nor should you. But the nature is to be able to see somebody as a person as opposed to a group gives you the ability to individually evaluate them as opposed to extemporaneously evaluate them based upon their racial features. At the time of King's speech, it was much more socially acceptable for white people to admit that their racial prejudice and belief in the white racial superiority. Correct, it was. I wonder why that changed. I wonder who changed that. I wonder why they did it. She loves to ask these questions, but she acknowledges that these changes took place without recognizing why they took place and who wanted to change them. But many white people have never witnessed the kind of violence to which blacks were subjected because the struggle for civil rights was televised. Was televised. Whites across the nation watched in horror as black men, women, and children were attacked by police dogs and fire hoses during peaceful protests and beaten and dragged away for lunch counters. Once the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, a landmark civil rights and U.S. labor law that outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, it was less acceptable for white people to admit racial prejudice. Why? I'm really confused. I don't understand. Who passed the law? What color were they? How'd that all happen? It's like, here are facts that changed something, but don't worry, it didn't change anything. It just put it deeper. They didn't want to be associated with the racist acts they witnessed on television. Why not? They were white supremacists and racist. Do you think during the time of slavery, when a slave was being whipped, do you think that it was the white person that was whipping them, or the people watching were sitting there going, "Oh, this is horrible, we must put an end to this"? It was accepted. It was an accepted practice. Horrible, but absolutely accepted. There were people at the same time who did not accept it and thought it was horrible and fought to change it. That's what created the abolitionist movement. But again, there's no reality orientation. It's that they just wanted to change it. Why? They're white supremacists. Why would they care? Do you think it was the Ku Klux Klan members and the white supremacist ideology which said, you know something? We can't be associated with this. We need to change it. In addition to the fact that discrimination was now illegal, and again, who made it that way? One line of King's speech in particular, that one day he might be judged by the content of his character and not the color of his skin, was seized upon by the white public because the words were seen to provide simple and immediate resolution to racial tensions. No. The reason why it was seized upon is because people resonated to be true. People seize upon the truth. The more you show people the truth, the more they recognize it. When I talk about a lot of clients that deal in racial issues, we all admit to their barriers that have taken place because of racial injustice historically. But as the years will go on, if we continue to get less and less racist, those barriers are going to go away and you'll have more and more equality because the system itself is not designed that way. There are problems in the system that need to be. if, in a sense, that if African Americans saved a percentage of their income and invested it, just that one act alone, and they continued to do that, it would create intergenerational wealth for the next generation. Now, it's not something that's taught to a lot of people, and they don't normally do it. Most of the clients that I see normally have nothing for their retirement, nothing put away, nothing, because it's not something they've ever thought about. They do spend a lot of money on other things. Specifically, the women love to spend money on through the years on hair products, color, earrings. We did this one time in a group. We just added up all the things that we spent money on, just to get a sense of where our ideologies are. And what the guy spent money on, sneakers and jeans was a big one, clothes in general. Chains was a big one. The nature of where the money goes that you do have, even if you have less, it doesn't mean you can't make more if you do the right things with the money. And one of the things I try to tell people to understand is that even if things are against you in certain areas, you have choices to make that can make your life still better. But a lot of times that education is not being taught. I know that Pythagoras' theorem is very important. For those of you who don't remember, it's a squared plus b squared equals c squared. But that is much less important than the idea of compound interest and how it affects people's economic status in life. And that's not taught in school, which to me is absolutely insane. And if you wanted to talk about things that could help people who are coming out from poverty, there are many things we could teach, and there are many things that we could put and foster. But again, this book doesn't talk about helping people or trying to bring somebody up or talk about the real aspects of systemic racism that are actually things that we could actually do something about. No. You just have to feel bad that you're white because you're part of a system that keeps people down. One line of, colorblindness was now promoted as a remedy for racism, with white people insisting that they didn't see race, or if they did, it had no meaning to them. Now, of course, that's not the case. And the fact was, even during when Martin Luther King made this speech, Martin Luther King did not become as popular then as he is today. Today, he is revered. At the time, he was not as revered. He did make a beautiful speech, and it did have an effect, and that speech has a long-lasting effect. But the fact was, many white people at that point were still, dismissing him at that point. Clearly, the civil rights movement didn't end racism, nor have claims of colorblindness. But reducing King's word to the simplistic idea illustrates how movement for social change are co-opted, stripped of their initial challenges, and used against the very cause from which they originated. I don't think that if Martin Luther King saw the advancements today, he would look down and say they're nothing. For example, a common response in the name of colorblindness is to declare that all individuals who say that race matters is the one who's racist. By definition. If race matters, then by definition, when you exclude people or include people because of race, that's racist, because you're doing it based upon the color of their skin. As I gave the example, if you voted for Barack Obama because he was black, that was a racist act. If you voted against Barack Obama because he was black, that's a racist act. The nature of why you're doing it creates whether it's racist or not by definition. But again, she's redefining it, so we can just throw out that definition. In other words, it is racist to acknowledge race. No, to acknowledge somebody's race is not racist. To say you are black, that's a statement of fact. To say I am white, to say that I am European, to say that I am a male, these are not acknowledgments that is racist. To say because you are black, you must be X, Y, or Z. You must have this political thought process. You must have this philosophy. You must see the world in this way. That would be racist. In fact, that's exactly what happened in Nazi Germany. If you are Jewish, you are this. And now, therefore, you need a yellow star on your arm. We need to exterminate you because you are the problem. And that's what's going on right now in China with the Uyghurs, where they're being exterminated and targeted and put into slavery by the Chinese government based upon their religious belief of being Muslim. And today this is going on. which you don't hear about in the media, and they're not talking about it. And no, we have to talk about the racism in this country because it's so much worse. Colorblind ideology from the perspective of a person of color. An example I often share occurred when I was co-leading a workshop with an African American man. A white participant said to him, "I don't see race. I don't see you as black." My co-trainer's response was, "Then how will you see racism?" He then explained to her that he was black, and he was confident that she could see this, and that her race meant that he had a very different experience in life than she did. Wow. So you're telling me that white people all have the same experience and black people all have the same experience. That's amazing, because in the groups that I've run, through all the years that I've run them, black people have had different experiences in the same group, and there have been white people that have had the same experiences as black people did. Amazing. And they were able to relate to each other. And then there were two black people in the room who had different experiences and couldn't relate to each other despite the fact of having the same color skin. It just is infuriating reading this, because it's denoting people down to the color of their skin, but saying that's not racist when it's the very definition of being racist. And the fact that the woman said she can't see he's black, I don't think means she couldn't tell what color he was. What she was trying to say in an inappropriate way was to say that I'm not going to judge you differently based upon the color of your skin. Now, by the way, there are people that lie about that. So that is true. I mean, you have to be also understand that there are people who say, "Oh yeah, I don't judge anybody. Oh, would you have them over to your house?" And no, we don't do that. You will see people like that who will treat other people differently. But that doesn't necessitate that the idea is still not good. You see, the issue is, what's the ideal? Do we want to get to a place where we see everybody by race? Or do we want to get to a place where we see everybody as equal people? Now, I can dislike you as an equal person. If she was ever going to understand our challenge racism, she would need to acknowledge this difference. Pretending that she did not notice that he was black was not helpful to him in any way, and it denied his reality. Indeed, it refused his reality, and kept her insular and unchallenged. The pretense is that she didn't notice his race, assumed that he was just like her, and in doing so, she projected her reality onto him. For example, I feel welcome at work, so you must too. I have never felt that my race mattered, so you must feel that yours too. Yours doesn't either. But of course, we don't see race of other people, and race holds deep social meaning for us. There were many classes when I was in grad school where I was the only, or one of the very few males in the classroom. And believe me, being in a classroom full of females, there's a difference. I was the outsider. I was different, and believe me, I felt it. Did that mean that there was sexist or sexism, or there was a aspect of sexism against me? I don't think so, but there was definitely a difference. Did I get treated differently because of my sex? The answer is yes, but that doesn't mean that the nature of the structure was sexist. There were individuals who felt that way. It would have been nicer if people said, I don't see you as that way, and I just kept me as part of the group, and it would have been nicer. I actually would have appreciated that, but that's not what happened. We might think of conscious racial awareness as the tip of the iceberg. The superficial aspect of our racial socializations, our intentions, always good, and we're supposed to acknowledge seeing nothing. Meanwhile, under the surface, there's a massive depth of racial socialization, message, beliefs, image, associations, internalized superiority and entitlements, perceptions, and emotions. Colorblind ideology makes it difficult for us to address these unconscious beliefs. While the idea of colorblindness may be started out as well-intentioned strategy for interrupting racism, in practice it has served to deny the reality of racism and thus hold it in place. That's a beautiful theory. Prove it. Give me some evidence. Explain to me a study that shows that this type of mentality does exactly what you just said. I don't believe it's true. And I don't believe it because I see what the effects are when people have it. The problem is people don't live up to the ideology of that mentality. It's not that the mentality is the problem. It's that people say it, but they don't mean it. Like, I love this one. What would happen if your daughter came home with an African-American man, right? That would be a situation where you're not judging a person by the content of their character, but you're judging by the color of their skin. Right? If you are okay with your daughter dating somebody who's African American and no problem if they intermarry into your family, then guess what? It's very difficult to claim you're racist. You want to say that there's still the systematic aspects of the problems in society? Well, there are systematic problems in society. That's got nothing to do with your individual racism. Now, if you say, on the other hand, I don't judge anybody by that, but my daughter is going to be marrying inside, there's a racist attitude. So racial bias is largely unconscious, and herein lies the deepest challenge, the defensive that ensures upon any suggestion of racial bias. This defensiveness is classic white fragility, because it protects our racial bias while simultaneously affirming our identities as open-minded. Yes, it's uncomfortably confronted with an aspect of ourselves that we don't like, but we can't change what we refuse to see. I happen to agree with that, by the way. You can't change what you refuse to see. But if it's not there, then you're not refusing to see it. And you just can't say, I'm going to assert this on every single individual and say, everybody has this. It's just not true. For people that are intermarried couples, in which she originally says she's not referring to those people that come from them or children that are biracial, again, sort of these problems come about. You're going to say that you're a systematic racist against, by the way, she utilized earlier on about the idea, well, you may have love your wife, but you're still suffering from sexism. Well, it's interesting because the entire nature of why it changed was because husbands love their wives, in which case they made the changes because she acknowledged herself that women themselves didn't have the power. So why did the men change? Because of the love of their wives. And the same thing happens with the love of our daughters and seeing our daughters wanting to be the best that they can be and wanting them to have equal opportunity. That creates the idea that you want your child to get what's equal to them. You don't go, well, my son should get more than my daughters because I believe in inequality. You see, the framework and the mindset was different of what those roles were. And they saw it differently. And that has culturally changed. But the nature wasn't, I'm doing this to discriminate against my daughter because I hate women. That's not how they came about with their ideas. And that's the problem with the idea of the book. Countless studies show empirically that people of color are discriminated against in the workplace. Imagine you had empirical evidence that your coworker was unintentionally discriminating against people of color during the hiring process. Given your belief in equality, you would possibly think there is an imperative to ask your coworker to stop. Now she goes, countless studies. Quote them. Show me them. Let me go over the studies. Let me see the studies. Let me see who made the studies. Has there been any variation of the studies? Are there counter studies? Nah. We just say countless studies. Because that's how you cite a book that is going to show people something and get them to learn. You pointed this discrimination out in the most diplomatic way possible. Still, what do you think your colleague's response would be? Would you hear gratitude that you brought the fact to that person's attention? Probably not. More likely, you could respond with hurt, anger, and defensiveness, insisting they were not racially discriminating, but had chosen the most qualified candidates, and the individual would certainly believe that it was true, even though you had empirical evidence that was not. This defensiveness is rooted in the false but widespread belief that racial discrimination can only be intentional. Our lack of understanding about implicit bias leads to aversive racism. Aversive racism. Next. I'm going to share a story with you that happened many years ago. I had a coworker who I became friends with, and we got to know each other a little bit, a lot bit. And happens I was watching a movie, and in the movie, he happened to have been Hispanic. And in the movie, there was this term being used that I wasn't familiar with, and it sounded almost like my friend in the term, in the movie. So the next day I came in, and I come over to him, and I see him with a big smile, and I go, hey, and I use the term, thinking that he was going to be like, whoa, cool, how'd you learn that, or how'd you know that, so like, how'd you get on the inside kind of thing. To which his mouth, he goes, do you know what you just said to me? I'm like, no. And it turned out to be a curse, and I felt humiliated when he was like, no, he was cracking up. And in the movie, it looked like he was saying, yo, my friend, sort of like the way sometimes people use the N-word with friends, except I didn't know they had one like that in the Spanish community also. And I told him about the movie, and I told him about the whole situation. And I apologized profusely. And I go, thank you for pointing it out, because I didn't want to be thinking, like, that's the word you want to use. I remember practicing it beforehand and feeling like such an idiot the next day. And it's important for people to point out these things. And it is important if somebody feels that somebody said something racial. In my own experience, I've had many clients throughout the years say inappropriate racist things to me, where I had to point it out to them. The only difference is I didn't think there was any malice or ill intent. It's sometimes just ignorance. And people make ignorant statements. We all have that capacity. That doesn't make us racist. So ignorance is something we should want to learn from each other to be able to change, but that doesn't make you inherently racist. Adverse racism. Adverse racism is a manifestation of racism that's well-intentioned people who see themselves as educated and progressive are likely to exhibit. It exists under the surface of consciousness because it conflicts with consciously held beliefs of racial equality and justice. Adverse racism is subtle by its insidious forms, as adverse racists enact racism in ways that allow them to remain positive self-image, have lots of friends of color. I judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. White enact racism while maintaining a positive image in many ways. Racializing racial segregation, but unfortunate but necessary to access good schools. I don't know anybody who's ever said the reason why we need racial segregation is so we can keep the schools good. I don't believe that as a mindset. I think that happens, that the schools get segregated, but for different reasons. Rationalizing our workplaces are virtually all white because people of color just don't apply. The workplaces I've worked in have never been all white. And if you are working in a place that's all white, that's not necessarily because you chose a place that's all white. Depending on what field you went into. The field that I went into, there's a lot more people of color, and especially where I work. But throughout the years, I've met people from many different backgrounds. Avoid direct racial language and using racial code terms such as urban, underprivileged, diverse, sketchy, and good neighbors. And where I work, we use the words fine. Denying that we have few cross-racial relationships by claiming how diverse our community and workplace is. And again, now having connection with the people is a problem. So this is where it gets circular in reasoning. If you are segregated, there's a problem. If you're diverse, there's a problem. Now you're just creating problems without any recognition that you just created a circular logical reasoning trap. That doesn't make any sense. You can't say that we have few. If you have you can't say how diverse your community or workplace is, and then say, well, your diverse community has no bearing on it. Of course, it does. Attributing inequality because whites and people of color to cause other than racism. Excuse me? Attributing inequality between whites and people of color to causes other than racism, meaning there's only one cause between any inequality. Therefore, by that logic, the NBA is the most racist organization that exists. They have kept out white people from being on that court because it is primarily African American and they are overrepresented by the population. They only make up 13% of the 6% males, 6% of the population. Therefore, only 6% of the NBA should be black, and therefore, by that definition, the NBA is inherently racist because it attributes inequality to some other attribute other than race. See, this is the difference between science and studying something and making assertions. As I gave the example earlier on of the people driving on the New Jersey Turnpike. And again, the belief was that the police were stopping African Americans at a higher rate on the New Jersey Turnpike because of the color of their skin. Except that when they took the pictures with the cameras and then the radar of the cars had nothing to do with any human touching the issue. African Americans were driving at generally faster rates. Not African Americans across the board, but more African Americans were than whites were percentage-wise, which is the reason why more African Americans percentage-wise were being stopped. And they went, oops, that doesn't fit the narrative. But again, that's the problem when it doesn't fit the narrative. So you're saying that anybody attributing any other cause other than racism is proof to that. No. That's called bad science and bad reasoning. You just don't say there is no other cause to the ability for this happening other than my thought process. My thought process is the only thing that makes it fall. If my thought process wasn't here, it wouldn't fall, because when I'm dead, I won't know if it fell or not. I've proved my point. I am the cause of gravity. It's insane, because that's the problem when you state a fact without any proof. Consider a conversation I had with a white friend. She was telling me about a white couple she knew who had just moved to New Orleans and bought a house for a mere $25,000. Of course, she immediately added, they also had to buy a gun, and Joan is afraid to leave the house. I immediately knew they bought her home in a black neighborhood. Excuse me? You immediately knew? That's funny, I was reading the book and I didn't know. They could have bought it in a really bad white neighborhood where there were drugs or violence or crime around them. Why did it have to be a black neighborhood? But again, your racism comes out really clear. This was a moment of white racial bonding between this couple who shared the story of racial danger and my friend. And then between my friend and me, she repeated the story. Through this tale, the four of us fortified familiar images of the horror of the black space and drew boundaries between us. And then, without ever having to directly name race or openly express our disdain for black space. Wow. Notice that the need for a gun is a key part of the story. It would not have the degree of social capital it holds if the emphasis was on the price of the house alone. No, I didn't think the gun or the house price told me the racial makeup of the neighborhood. There are many people that I know that live in really, really rich white neighborhoods that own guns to protect their property in case. In fact, we just saw on the news where I did that video of that gated community where that couple came out with their guns. Wow, they had guns and they weren't protecting themselves from the black community. Turns out the black community showed up anyway. Excuse me, let me rephrase that. The protesters showed up. I don't know the primarily, I saw the video and I saw black people, but I don't know if they were primarily black or that was just in the video that you saw. There could be a lot of white people that were there too, as a lot of white people are in the protests as well. So this idea that somehow that it must have been black people is just racist again. It would not have the degree of social capital it holds if the emphasis were the price of the house alone. Rather, the story's emotional power rests on why a house would be that cheap, because it's in a black neighborhood where white people literally might not get out alive. While very negative and stereotypical representations of blacks were reinforced in that exchange, not naming race provided plausible deniability. In fact, in preparing to share this incident, I texted my friend and asked her the name of the city her friends had moved to. I also wanted to confirm my assumptions that she was talking about a black neighborhood. I shared the text exchange here. Now, I'm going to go through the text exchange in a second, but notice, after she wants to write the story in the book, let me go back now and reaffirm that I was correct. It would have been funny if she wasn't, but I'm assuming based upon the fact that it's in the book, it's here, she was. Hey, that city you say friends bought the houses for $25,000. New Orleans. They said they lived in a very bad neighborhood and they each have a gun to protect themselves. I wouldn't pay 5 cents to that neighborhood. I assume it's a black neighborhood. Yes, you get what you pay for. I'd rather pay $500,000 and live somewhere I wasn't afraid. I wasn't asking because I want to live there. I'm writing about this in my book and the way that white people talk about race without ever coming out and talking about race. I wouldn't want to live there. It's too far away from me. Again, the person that was reacting to her. But the person saying this was saying, listen, I'm not making this a racial issue. I'm saying I don't want to live there because it's too dangerous. Now, there are many white neighborhoods that you're not going to want to live in because it's too dangerous. So notice that when I simply ask what city the house is in, she repeats the story about the neighborhoods being so bad that her friends need guns. Yes, because that's what she's focused on. There are certain women that perseverate over certain ideas. That doesn't make them racist. I have clients that tell me the same things over and over. Now, again, you're not a clinician and you don't seem to understand how people think. But if you've ever spoken to somebody who is like the Edith Bunker character from All in the Family, they stay focused on their idea. Her idea was about the fact that it was too far away and the fact that she needed guns and it was this unsafe neighborhood. She wasn't focused on the fact that it was a black neighborhood. Unlike you, she was focused on it was a dangerous neighborhood. When I ask if the neighbor is black, she's comfortable confirming that it is. When I tell her that I'm interested in how whites talk about race without talking about race, she switches the narrative. No, she goes back to what she's talking about. Now her concern is about not wanting me to live so far away. This is a classic example of averse racism. Wow, that's racism. Holding deep racial disdain that surfaces in daily discourse, but not being able to admit it because the disdain conflicts with our own self-image and professional beliefs. Like I said, if she was saying this about a neighborhood of, let's say, a basketball team was moving down the block from the neighborhood in a multi-million-dollar neighborhood, do you think she'd be like, oh my God, we have to get out of here, we're all in danger? Readers may be asking themselves, but if the neighborhood is really dangerous, why is acknowledging the danger a sign of racism? Yes, it's a great question. Research and implicit bias has shown that perceptions of criminal activity are influenced by race. Bull. Statistical analysis is instituted by race. 6% of the population is African American. 40% of all murders take place by African Americans. That's not, and by the way, not rich African Americans. Okay? It goes by poverty level. So the nature of saying I'm more worried about this neighborhood because of that is not because of racial bias. It's called facts. But again, we don't want to care about facts. We only care about the narrative. White people will perceive danger simply by the presence of black people who cannot trust our perceptions when it comes to race and crime. Wow. But regardless of whether the neighborhood is actually more or less dangerous than other neighborhoods, what is the salient about the exchange is how it functions racially. It's not superfluous to the conversation how factual that is. And that's the problem with your analysis. What that means for the white people engaged in it. For my friend and me, this conversation did not increase our awareness of the dangers of some specific neighborhood. Actually, it did if I knew what the neighborhood was. Rather, the exchange reinforced our fundamental belief about black people. Bull. There's nothing in here that said anything about black people. There are neighborhoods where African Americans live, in middle-class neighborhoods where they own homes. That is very, very safe to go through, no problems at all. No issues to go through it, and people aren't afraid to go through it. They don't go, oh my God, stay away from the black neighborhood. Then you have white neighborhoods where there's very much crime, and there's a lot of violence, and there's a lot of drug use that are very dangerous to go through, and they're white, and they're still dangerous, because practically you learn these things. Toni Morrison uses the term race talk to capture the explicit insertion into everyday life of racial signs and symbols that have no meaning other than positioning African Americans into the lowest level of racial hierarchy. Casual race talk is a key component of white racial framing because it accomplishes interconnected goals of alleviating whites from demeaning people of color. Race talk always implies racial us and them. It's very interesting that she says this. I had a Jewish client not too long ago who told me after the session he was going to hear this rabbi. And this guy was coming, his rabbi was from Africa. And I said, what are you going to hear this rabbi from Africa for? He goes, well, the truth is, where I'm from, there's not too many African rabbis. And this one was a prince. He was an African prince, and he converted to Judaism and became a rabbi. He said there are going to be thousands of Jews coming to hear this guy talk. Now, this guy was white, wanting to go hear an African rabbi. Why? Because he found that to be interesting based upon the cultural change that he made. And the fact that he was a prince intrigued him even more. And a whole bunch of people were coming to hear him. That being the case, you get to see that certain people have certain ideologies based upon their feelings, not always about negativity and race. Consider an experience I had with aversive racism. My last academic position was in a state I've never been to before my interview. Throughout the 3 days of interviewing, other white people warned me not to buy a house in Springfield or Holyoke if I took the position, especially if I had children. Now, while no one openly named race, the racial coding was not lost on me. I now knew there were people of color who were concentrated in that area. At the same time, because no one directly mentioned race, we could all deny that it was actually talked about. Returning my hotel room for first night, I looked up the demographics. Sure enough, Springfield and Hokluk had significantly higher populations, close to 50% of black and brown people starting one day on my new visit. My fellow whites having communicated the racial boundaries to me. I'm confused. If 50% were black and brown, what were the other 50%? Why are you assuming that the black and brown people were the dangerous ones? Maybe it was the white ones that were the dangerous ones in that neighborhood. Because they're only 50%. So your assertion that those neighborhoods were dangerous because there were black people there is erroneous. And like I said, not black people are dangerous. Generally, lower income black people are more dangerous in crime-infested areas, and generally because crime has happened. My teacher education students also engage in race talk, reinforcing the boundaries between us and them while positioning us as superior. They engaged in race talk while they expressed fear about being placed in dangerous neighborhoods while describing their hometowns as sheltered. These depictions are relentlessly strengthened by news stories that position violent crime committed in primarily white suburban communities as shocking, yet claiming the ones that had grown up in a sheltered environment raises a question that begs to be answered. Sheltered from what? And in contrast to whom? If we grow up in environments with few, if any, people of color, are we not, in fact, less sheltered from racist conditions? Because we have to rely on narrow and repetitive media representations, jokes, omissions, and warnings for an understanding of color of people. Conversely, positioning white spaces as sheltered and those who are raised in them as racially innocent traps into classic narratives of people of color are not innocent. Racist images are resultant white fears can be found in all levels of society, and myriads of studies demonstrate that whites believe that people of color, and blacks in particular, are dangerous. Whites really consider how sheltered and safe their spaces may be from the perspective of people of color. Trayvon Martin's experience is in the gated white community because it reverses the actual direction of racial danger. This narrative may be one for the most pernicious. When you consider the moral judgment we make about people we deem as racist in our society, we need to deny our own racism, even to ourselves. Make sense? We believe we are superior at a deeply internalized level and act on this belief in a practice of our lives. But we must not deny this belief as to fit into society and maintain our self-identity as good moral people. Unfortunately, reverse racism only protects racism because we can't challenge our racial filters. If we can't consider the possibility that we have them, of course some whites explicitly avow racism. We might consider these whites actually more aware and honest about their bias than those who consider ourselves open-minded. Yet we have rarely thought critically about the biases we inevitably hold and how we may be expressing them. So, being overtly racist is much better than being subversively racist. So, for the people who are on the alt-right, who hate black people because of the fact they believe in white supremacy, you guys are much better off than the people who don't believe that way and are actually trying to maintain and change the laws and done all these things to make things better. Excellent. I think that's a very brilliant point, Ms. DiAngelo. I'm going to stop here at this point. We're on page 47 of this book in the third chapter. The next part she goes through is cultural racism, which ends the third chapter, and actually I think I'll probably be getting the fourth chapter in the next segment. Again, if you disagree with anything I said, please tell me. I'd love to hear your point of view. If you liked the video, hit like. If you disliked it, tell me why, and then hit dislike. And of course, please subscribe, share, and go to the Subscribe-star link and become a patron to this channel. Thank you very much. Have a good night and good mental health.